is that you don't have to give away your principles in doing so.
Well, we ought to be willing to make progress, and that's my idea of compromise. Is if we're moving in the right direction. So, for instance, for tax reform, I know how I'd write the tax code if I could write it all from scratch. I'm pretty sure I'll never get the opportunity to do that. And so if I could get an agreement where we'd simplify the code, lower marginal rates, have a more competitive system that was more honest and wiped out at least some of the crony capitalism in our tax code, I'd like to get rid of all of it. But if I can make progress, I'd take that.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, Gary. Look, the frustration with Congress is completely appropriate and completely deserved. But I would argue that we shouldn't paint everybody with the same brush.
And we don't.
There's a simple, factual, objective matter. The House has passed appropriation bills. The House has passed legislation to deal with problems in our tax code. The House has passed policy that would encourage economic growth and improve the Keystone Pipeline and repeal the medical device tax. Sensible things, and Senator Reid refuses to take it up. So there is an objective difference between how these... Now, I acknowledge it. The end result is nothing gets done. But it's not quite fair to blame everybody equally.
No, and I'm not trying to do that. Listen, I think there are good Democrats, Republicans, people of goodwill in there. The problem is, it's kind of like going after terrorists a little bit. I hate to use this analogy, but going after terrorists, in order to get the terrorists, you're also going to get the good people. And that's not a good way of going about it, maybe. And yet at the same time, the collateral damage that good people of goodwill who want to really make good policy there, they become the collateral damage of this kind of political way of looking at everything.
Well, I think there's a reasonable chance, better than even chance, that Republicans will take control of the Senate. And then we've got a new dynamic. We've got a dynamic where Republicans will have complete control of the legislature. Now, we won't have the White House, obviously,
right?
At least not for 2 years. And so we will not be able to get our way on everything by any means. But we will be able, for the first time, to be able to send legislation to the president, at least occasionally. We won't have 60 Republican senators, and so we'll have to persuade some Democrats on most issues, but we'll be able to win that argument on some occasions, be able to send some legislation to the president, and we need to do that. We need to demonstrate that we have the competence to actually govern in a constructive way.
There are two other topics I want to talk to you about this morning. I don't want to lose those. Immigration. I'm reading a lot here the last couple of days, and it's saying, well, the president may put this off. Now, there are an awful lot of people saying, don't touch this, don't put an executive order down. The president even said so much a year ago when he said, I can't just make an executive order out there to do this. I need Congress. Well, all of a sudden, we're hearing, well, maybe I don't need Congress. Where's that whole thing right now?
Well, this is the problem when you have a president who believes that, laws don't necessarily apply to him. How do you know where it stands? The president unilaterally rewrites Obamacare every few weeks. Just changes it by executive fiat. He has no authority to do that. That's not legal. And it's completely impossible to anticipate what he's going to do next because it's up to his own whim instead of actual law. This is one of the problems when you don't respect the rule of law. You end up having this arbitrary government by an individual. So I can't tell you, Gary, what the president's going to do about this next wave of amnesty. I read the same things. Yep. He's got vulnerable Democratic senators who don't want him to do it. But I don't know who's going to prevail with him. And unfortunately, it's not the written law.
There's a sense right now that the president, and again, I'm from a lot of readings that I've done, the president is governing for the people who are running come November. And that he is running for, basically running the country from his particular vantage with the part that he runs for the people who are his hardcore constituency. And beyond that, a lot of us are kind of feeling left out in the cold here a little bit. Are you getting the same feeling from your particular standpoint?
Yeah, I understand that. I think this president has been extremely divisive. I mean, his whole campaign was to pit one group of Americans against another systematically. And you got to give him credit for a purely tactical point of view. It worked for him. And unfortunately, he's governing in the same mode. So rather than sitting down with Republicans and saying, for instance, how do we fix this tax code? Right? That doesn't have to be a left versus right thing. That doesn't have to be partisan. Ronald Reagan, reformed the tax code with Democrats controlling the House. This can be done, but there is no such discussion. The president doesn't want to have the conversation. So, it's very frustrating.
Senator, we're going to take a very quick break. We're going to come right back, and I need to ask you about ISIS and where things stand on that. And the Congress obviously coming back, the Senate coming back to deal with that. What is the right thing to do? We'll ask Senator Pat Toomey that when we return here on the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show with Senator Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania, talking the issues this morning. Before we get to ISIS, Pat, I wanted to ask you a question. The president said yesterday, he boasted yesterday in his Labor Day speech, he said, we changed the tax code that was skewed too much to the wealthy at the expense of working families, quote unquote. And he basically, boasted of raising taxes on the wealthy. And I was talking earlier this morning with another guest, and I said, this idea that we're raising taxes on the wealthy has a domino effect the whole way down through every other person here in America. Do you see it the same way?
Well, it does. It's effectively a big tax increase on small businesses, and it prevents the startup of new small businesses and reduces the expansion of existing small businesses, because small businesses are almost always taxed at the individual tax rate. So very counterproductive, but it's part of what the president wants to do and part of his redistribution of wealth plan.
ISIS has become the bane right now of the world. Every day we're hearing something about them. David Cameron says they're a direct threat to every European country. We must use all the resources at our disposal. As he's saying that last week, the president's saying we don't have a plan yet. And they were juxtaposed on the screens here. I was watching on a lot of TV channels, both right and left, and they're saying, wait a second. And there are a lot of people out there saying, ISIS hasn't just come up on us here in the last 2 or 3 weeks. They've been here for like 4 years or so. We had a chance to deal with them before. We're not dealing with them. Why is it that we're not ready now with a plan to deal with this group?
There's no excuse, Gary. There's just no excuse. It is deeply disturbing. This is such a dangerous organization. I mean, these are the people that Al-Qaeda found too extreme.
Right.
Okay, so the people that murdered 3,000 Americans, they think that ISIS is too extreme for them. I mean, what more do you need to know? It is their declared goal to murder Americans wherever they can. And now that they've formed a bit of a nation state of their own, they call it a caliphate, which, frankly, if it hadn't been for policy errors by this administration, would have been very, very difficult for them to pull this off. I think very unlikely that they could have. But now that they have, it becomes a recruiting ground. And there are people with American passports there. There are all kinds of Europeans, which means there are people who can come and go at will to America, to Europe. And it's very, very disturbing. So the threshold question for us has to be, are we going to tolerate this? Are we going to tolerate a nation state that is vastly more dangerous to us than the Taliban control of Afghanistan was? And we just don't hear from the president. It's mind-boggling.
It's amazing. I was listening to David Cameron the other day. He said police will be given power to seize passports at the border. Passports are not an automatic right. Certainly that gets you into a slippery slope, and yet at the same time, security is changing on its face. Final question. What would you do right now? You mentioned you've identified them as somewhat of a state. If the United States had to go it alone, if the president were to change his thinking and came to Congress and said, I want a declaration of war, or came and said, I want to have permission to go do this military exercise and take this group out because it doesn't seem like you contain it, what would your reaction be?
Well, I think what the president needs to do is provide more and more sophisticated weapons to the Kurds, who have a demonstrated competent force of ground troops that is capable and willing to fight, and they've had some success. Provide additional support for the Iraqi army, which has been less consistent, but sometimes willing and able to fight back. They have to make sure that the other Arab states, there's no Arab state in the region that's happy to have ISIS power there. Get them to help us with the Sunni tribes that rose up when we surged troops years ago in Iraq, get them to persuade them to rise up against ISIS. These are the kinds of things the president has to do. It's a very dangerous threat.
Senator, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We'll keep our eye on what does happen, and we look forward to our next time with you.
Thanks for having me, Gary.
Have a great day. Thank you. Senator Pat Toomey with us here on the Gary Sutton Show. When we come back, John LeBoutelier joins us. He's normally with us on Monday morning at 9, but today he moved to 10:05 to talk about things from his particular point of view. All here on the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. It's 10 o'clock.